Okay, and so before we get into the panel, I'm just going to show a brief video um, that kind of summarizes who Henrietta Lacks was and how her case came to be.
Henrietta Lacks was a sort of poor Black tobacco farmer who grew up in Southern Virginia. And in 1951, she was diagnosed with cervical cancer. At that point, she had moved up to Baltimore, and she went to Johns Hopkins for treatment because it was the only place anywhere near her that treated Black patients. So this was the era of segregation, and the hospitals had the quote unquote colored wards, which was the only place that Black patients or poor patients could be seen. And without telling her, before treating her tumor, her doctor just cut a little piece and put it in a dish. And he sent that down the hall to George Guy, who was the head of tissue culture research at Hopkins. And George Guy had been trying to grow human cells outside of the body for decades, and it had never worked. And for reasons that remain a mystery, Henrietta's cells just never died. So they started doubling their numbers every 24 hours. They went from like 1 dish to 2 to 4 to 8 to 16, and then just sort of pretty quickly took over the lab. And George Guy started calling his colleagues and saying, I think I have the first immortal human cell line, which is what they're called, which means they'll just grow and divide forever. And in response, his colleagues all said, great, can we have some? Because there'd been this enormous effort to grow cells outside the body for 100 years, because we really didn't know a lot about cells at that point. And in response to all of his colleagues asking for them, George Guy sent them to anyone who wanted to use them for research. And they spread around the world this way really fast. And they were one of the most important things that happened to medicine. They were used to help create polio vaccine. They went up in first space missions to see what would happen to human cells in zero gravity. They were used to create our most important cancer medications like vincristine and tamoxifen. Her cells were the first ever cloned, her genes some of the first ever mapped. They were used to help develop in vitro fertilization. Basically, almost all of the vaccines we take today can be traced back to research with her cells. There isn't a person out there who hasn't benefited from research on her cells.
Mr. Nelson has confessed to killing 15 men over a period of 5 years.
The surprising tenacity of her cancer cells, which made them so important to medical research, also ultimately took her life. Henrietta Lacks died in October 1951, at the age of 31. As her cells were taken without her knowledge, in an era before the concept of informed consent existed, Henrietta died never knowing how important her cells would be. Even her family didn't learn of the true extent of her legacy until science writer Rebecca Skloot began working with Henrietta's daughter Deborah to uncover the truth almost 5 decades later.
Rebecca, she worked hand in hand with my mother, Deborah Lacks. They went on journeys to Clover, Virginia, to talk to family members. They did a lot of work together. They hit the road a lot. They put a lot of miles on their cars. My mom was 2 years old when Henrietta passed away. So she never knew her mother.
As Deborah learned about these things, there's so much mixed emotion in it, because on the one hand, look at all this incredible stuff my mother did for science and for the world. That gave her a level of peace with her mother's death that she had wanted her entire life. At the same time, there was a lot of anger about the fact that everyone has benefited from these cells except her family.
This information was out there for so many years, and the family was not even aware of Henrietta's, that they had taken cells from Henrietta Lacks, and these cells have been used all over the world by scientists, labs, researchers, and millions of dollars have been made, and you still have the family struggling with basic health care. You know, we gotta recognize the past, but kind of like move forward and move in a positive direction to make sure that this doesn't happen again to our family or anybody else's family. And the Lax family is making sure that we continue to move forward to honor and preserve her legacy and speak about her life.
So they collaborated with the NIH and formed what's known as the Gila Genome Committee, where a few members of the Lax family and a group of scientists sit on this committee, and anyone who wants to do research with the Henrietta genome have to put in an application that is reviewed by members of the family and the NIH scientists. There's just, it was unprecedented. There's never been a moment like that where research, quote unquote, research subjects were part of the decision-making mechanism of science.
The family now has a seat at the table. So instead of us being the last to know, we will be the first to know.
Writing's not that easy, but Grammarly can help. This sentence is grammatically correct.
The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks is about so many different things. It's about science and communication and how important it is for scientists to be able to communicate with the public. It's a story about journalism. What happens when people tell your story? It's very much a story about race and science and race and medicine. So much of the history of science and medicine was built on the backs of Black people without their knowledge. And so it's so important that Henrietta's story be told as part of that history. And so that's the concept behind Black Lives Matter, is saying, yeah, this Black Life Matter. And it matters that we talk about it, and it matters that we tell Black stories. And look at what can happen when we try to kind of squash those stories. It has generations of impact.
This year marks the 100th anniversary of Henrietta's birth, and her incredible immortal cells continue to be more important than ever. With the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, the HeLa cells were at the forefront of the early research which helped to shape our understanding of the virus.
Within the first kind of few days of when we really realized, oh wow, this is a pandemic, this is terrifying, I started getting texts from members of the Lax family saying, tell me Henrietta's got this. Like, Henrietta, HeLa cells are working on this, right? You know, and I do think that it says a lot about the Lax family, that their first response to the pandemic from so many of them was, okay, how is HeLa dealing with this? You know, we know she's got this.
It just makes me proud, because she's not only helping a specific group of people, but she's helping everybody worldwide. She's saving lives. She's giving life. So, I mean, with these, I say, magical cells.
When I do speaking engagements, people come up to me and they say, I have children because of your grandmother. That's a heartwarming feeling when, you know, your grandmother has died, but yet she's still providing life. So for her to know that she is saving and impacting so many lives, she would be smiling from ear to ear. That beautiful smile, that beautiful Henrietta smile, it'll light up a room.
My name is Nicole Hockley, and my 6-year-old son Dylan was murdered at Sandy Hook School
Oh my God,
for more than 8.
Okay. Good boy. Okay. Okay. All right. Just a second now. All right. Thank you for watching that. Yeah, and then also I apologize about the ads. That is something that I cannot control. And now we can get started with the panel.
Yeah, so now that we've watched that short video and everyone kind of has a background understanding of who Henrietta Lacks was and what her legacy is today, we're gonna hop into the panel to get a better understanding of how medical racism is very typical and almost a characteristic of the scientific and medical industry's history in the United States, and how this racism persists here today. We have an amazing lineup of panelists, and I want to thank all of you for coming here. and being willing to take the time out of your day to speak on this topic. And so I know we did brief introductions, but if you could all just introduce yourselves, explain the kind of work you do, and then just kind of share how your work contributes to combating racism in medicine, science, or just in general. So I guess we could go in the order of the list, although Anna is not here yet. She'll be joining in a little bit. So Dr. Susan Lederer, if you wanted to start.
Sure.
Thanks.
So I think I recall, my name is Susan Lederer. I'm the chair of the Department of Medical History and Bioethics in the School of Medicine and Public Health, and a professor of history in the history department. And I'm a historian of American medicine and public health. And some of my work has dealt with the history of human experimentation and changing attitudes about who are the appropriate subjects of medical experiments. And because of the long history of racism in the United States, race is an integral part of that story. I teach medical students and I teach undergrads. I hope that in that teaching, I contribute to understanding the persistence of racism in medicine and in American society. So that's it very, very briefly.
Awesome, thank you. And then we have Katrina Morrison here, if you want to introduce yourself.
I'd love to. Hi, everyone. My name's Katrina Morrison. As was mentioned, I am a JD candidate at the University of Wisconsin Law School. I'm also the Health Equity Director at the Wisconsin Alliance for Women's Health. And so at the Alliance, our vision is that every woman at every age, at every stage of life is able to reach her optimal health, safety, and economic security. And so we really work on this vision, and we work to combat racism at all levels and in all systemic structures by informing, involving, and inspiring individuals to be effective advocates for positive change. Because at the end of the day, we really believe that policy should happen with women, and specifically with women of color, and not to women or to women of color. So that's who I am. Thank you for the opportunity.
Hi, I'm Nicole Nelson. I'm a professor also in the Medical History and Bioethics Department here in the School of Medicine and Public Health. And I'm also the director of the Health and Humanities Undergraduate Certificate Program here on campus. So in my teaching here, I teach about the history of genetics alongside the history of eugenics in the United States as a way of looking at not only scientific racism, but also scientific ableism and the intersection of racism, sexism, and ableism, and understanding who is targeted by those eugenics programs. I also teach as part of the MD program, again, thinking about bias and discrimination in medicine and how those can be recognized and disrupted.
I'm Brenda Gayle Plummer. I am a professor of history. I have a shared appointment with the history department and with the Department of Afro-American Studies. My research interests are 20th century African-American history, race relations, particularly in relationship to international issues, and Caribbean history. As to the answer to the question about how my work helps to combat medical racism, it doesn't, at least not directly. So I see my participation here as perhaps providing some historical context to some of the discussions that we'll have.
All right. Thank you so much. I believe all of the panelists that are here right now have had the chance to introduce themselves. So we are going to jump into the first question of the panel. So the first question is, how would you describe the impact of Henrietta Lacks's cells? So this can be speaking about the medical impact, historical impact, or the societal impact, especially given your unique areas of expertise. So we would love to hear about that, and feel free to unmute yourselves for the panelists and add your insight.
Sue, you want to take this one?
I'll let you start. I'll come after you.
Yeah, well, I think you got a good sense of the answer to that question in some sense from the video in terms of scientifically what these cells have done. In terms of the history of biology, they're extremely important because, as the video points out, they're the first immortal cell line. And so any and all cell culture research that was done in vitro in the glass, often started with these cell lines. And even today, we see these cell lines being used as kind of the default cell line, basically, depending on what research you want to do. So they're extremely important in that sense because they come as sort of basic reagent for biomedical research. But the story itself of Henrietta's cells, and particularly, in the version that we get from the immortal life of Henrietta Lacks, I think also, adds another layer to the conversation about thinking about the history of medical consent, medical racism, that becomes a sort of popular story that a lot of people know and can discuss. So it's kind of, brought those issues to the forefront of public conversation so that we're talking about, an event that's not just the Tuskegee syphilis trials as an instance of talking about racism in medical settings.
Hi, thank you, Nicole, for that. I think I don't need to say more about just the incredible importance of her cells and how much revenue they've generated because of their absolute essential nature to biological work as it occurs now. I think it's been really fascinating to watch how important her story became via Rebecca Skloot's telling to larger issues in American society about the use of biological material. For example, I think the fact that her story came out, I think it was either 2010 or 2011, it really had a profound impact on the highest levels of American medical research about racism in American society and about, questions that people had kind of they hadn't really overlooked, but hadn't received as much attention about who owns your biological material, about patenting genes, about, about fairness, about equity, about knowing that you're participating in a biological experiment. And some of these things, I think we're still waiting to see what the impact is going to be through, the incredible development of genomics and, just the ubiquity of people sharing their genetic information through all kinds of proprietary companies like 23andMe, and whether or not we're all going to benefit from that incredible knowledge that's being generated.
To further complicate this, I'm just wondering if we could also talk about the whole question of fetal cell research, because that introduces, some political and ideological questions into this, the larger discussion of, who owns biological materials.
Well, do we have, how many hours do we have? No,
we technically have until 8 p.m. So it's as of now, plenty of time.
No, I think you're absolutely right. Fetal cells, we're seeing it play out right now with COVID-19, the fear that the development of the vaccines, utilized fetal cell lines, maybe, collected 30 or 40 years ago. And, what do we do with that information? It's not a small question.
Thank you all for responding to that question, and I'll toss in another one. So thinking more specifically about Henrietta's story, Can any of you speak to how much of Henrietta's treatment was due to systemic racism and how much was due to a lack of regulation of patients' rights? Kind of going back to the question of, ownership of biological material.
If I could
I'll take.
Oh, you can go right ahead.
Oh, no, please, Katrina, you go first.
Okay. Oh, thank you. Okay. So I was hoping to just take a step back first and really talk about the reproductive justice framework, which is a term and a movement that was coined by 12 Black women in 1994 and has 3 tenets: the right to have children, the right to not have children, and the right to parent children in safe environments. And so with that reproductive justice framework comes the idea that several factors work together to determine our access to reproductive health care and our ability to make informed, appropriate reproductive health care decisions. And so these factors include a variety of things, particularly race, age, socioeconomic status, religion, where one lives, etc. And so I think it's really important to look at practices like these through the reproductive justice lens, because when we do so, we're able to see how unevenly and unfairly these practices target low-income Black people, and particularly what we've seen is also Black women and other women of color as well. And so I think that, of course, there was a lack of regulation, but that does not excuse the inhumane treatment that people of color have faced at the hands of the medical institution for generations in this country. I mean, there was also a lack of regulations during slavery, but Black women were still unjustly performed surgical experiments upon that still to this day are used in gynecology practices with no consent, with no anesthesia, with physicians operating under the racist notion that Black people don't feel pain, which we still see pop up today when Black people go to the doctor and their pain is not believed, they are belittled, they are condescended, they are not listened to because they are believed to be stronger than that. And so I feel like we really, while there may have been a lack of regulation, in my mind, that plays no role in how cruel it was to take the cells from Henrietta Lacks without her consent, without her knowledge, and how the use of her cells has continued without any compensation and little recognition to her and her family.
So I thought that I would speak to the fact that the treatment that Henrietta received was part and parcel of the system of systemic racism that operated in Baltimore and across the entire United States. In the video you saw, Rebecca Skloot said Hopkins was the only hospital that took Black patients. That's not quite true. In fact, Daniel Hill Williams, a very prominent African-American physician, established the Provident Hospital in Baltimore in 1894, but it was a small hospital. It was under-resourced, undercapitalized. It didn't have the kind of cutting-edge treatment that was available at a hospital like Johns Hopkins. And so Hopkins Hospital, when it was opened, was unusual in that the benefactor, a Quaker millionaire, decided it should be open to people of all races, which was an unusual thing to do. And so that's one of the reasons that Henrietta Lacks had access to the treatment that she had. I do not dispute in any way that the treatment that she received was not racist. Hopkins was an incredibly racist organization that became more racist as Jim Crow became established in Baltimore, where redlining was practically invented for residential segregation and who could enter the hospital. So she received care in a segregated ward. They decided early on that Black bodies and white bodies couldn't be next to each other, so they had a segregated, they had a segregated morgue. They had a segregated blood bank because it was believed that the blood of races was distinct, and they had, so they kept blood separated by the race of the donor, and they did not transfuse across the color line. And it was really only into the 1970s that Hopkins fully integrated its patient wards. However, the other thing I would say is that it was pretty common practice for physicians to take cells from any interesting body. And it turned out that Henrietta Lacks's cells were extraordinary in many ways. But the practice of taking the cells was something that Hopkins physicians did with every interesting case.
Yeah, maybe I can add to that because I think this underscores the point that Katrina was making about intersectionality and the need to consider here, socioeconomic status alongside race, alongside sex, in order to get a sort of good understanding of what was going on here. A comparable case that you can look at that involves a patient in the 1970s who also had cells taken without his consent, and the cells were then used to patent a cell line, is a case called Moore v. Regents of California that took place based on a case in 1970s. This is a similar type of case where under the guise of treatment, the doctor took the cell lines from this patient, patented the cell line with the intent to sell and profit from it, and only much later did the patient manage to find this out. Now, one of the big differences here, though, is that even though this involves a white male patient, it involves a white male patient who was able to hire and retain a lawyer in order to bring forth a lawsuit in this case, and also was able to have the means to figure out exactly what was going on and understand that some of the biological samples being taken from him were not within the course of his treatment. So there's sort of multiple layers here of access to justice, basically, and we see those kind of piling on top of each other in Henrietta Lacks's case, because socioeconomic status and education both play a role in preventing the Lacks family here from being able to access knowledge about what was happening in this ongoing use of her cells.
And the ongoing misleading of her family about how they had actually retrieved the cells, why they were trying to take Lacks family blood to do further genetic studies. I think it's a continuing story of misuse, exploitation, lack of consent, and information.
Thank you for all three of you for providing input on that question. So I guess like stepping back even a little bit further and kind of talking about like examples of medical racism and or exploitation. Can any of you speak on like larger historical examples of unethical experimentation that have happened in the US? Just just in case if some of our audience members aren't quite as knowledgeable about US history. So I just wanted to kind of throw that question out there.
Well, I see you have someone who's going to talk about Marion Sims, which I would have done, but I'll defer to whoever that will be.
Well, Katrina, would you like to say a little bit more? I mean, you were referring to Sims, I assume.
Yes, I was. Yes, I was referring to Marion Sims. I essentially, just sort of recapping what I stated before, he did experiments, very cruel experiments on enslaved Black women. And because of the experiments that he did without any anesthesia and without any of their consent or full knowledge of what was happening to them, there are many tools and techniques that he was able to develop from that experimentation that are still used in gynecology practices today and in reproductive health care. And so if there's somebody who wanted to talk in more detail about Marion Sims, by all means. A few other examples that come right to mind, though, are the inhumane birth control trials in Puerto Rico, in which Puerto Rican women were given, they were tested upon with birth control, but they could not read the documents that they were being forced to sign because it was not in their language. They also did not have full consent or full knowledge. And it's because of those inhumane birth control trials that the FDA was able to approve birth control in 1960. And the reason that they went to Puerto Rico for the trials is because such trials were not ethical in the United States. And then, of course, as was mentioned earlier, is the Tuskegee experiment, in which Black men were, they had syphilis, and despite medical professionals having treatment for syphilis, the sexually transmitted infection, they wanted to see what the effects of syphilis had left untreated. And so they did not provide treatment to these Black people, and it resulted in many of them dying horrible deaths.
I think what Katrina is talking about brings up an interesting point, and that's the sort of implication of medicine with prevailing ideologies of the time. The thing with, of course, Marion Sims is considered, I guess, the father of gynecology, but there were other doctors who came up with ideas that the traumas that enslaved people were experiencing were actually diseases. There was one called something like dysesthesia ethiopica. And there's another one called droptomania, which supposedly caused enslaved people to run away, right? So it's very difficult, in the 19th century to separate these practices from ideology. And Katrina also mentioned the Puerto Rican case, where essentially we're talking about colonialism here, right? And the availability of colonized subjects to be exploited in ways that were not considered appropriate in metropoles.
Yeah. And actually, I would add, I know that female medical students at the University of Puerto Rico Medical School had to participate in the birth control trials or they would fail biochemistry. So they weren't being, they were coerced essentially into participating. And, as I think perhaps people are well aware, that the early birth control hormones were much more powerful than the ones that are used today. And there were powerful side effects associated with it, and perhaps long-term. So, and again, an argument that a colleague of mine, Vanessa Gamble, has made is that, people many people know of the Tuskegee syphilis study, a 40-year study of untreated syphilis conducted by the Public Health Service that's supposed to aid the public health, in which they're withheld effective treatment. But that's just the tip of a very, very large iceberg. African-American bodies were valuable to medicine, before birth, and even after death. I happen to be working on a project now that looks at how people who teach anatomy receive bodies, to teach medical students. And it won't surprise you when I say the overwhelming majority of the material in the anatomical lab was secured from people of color. Oh, looks like Anna is terrific. Sorry.
Well, since Anna just got here, so if you want to quick introduce yourself, your name, pronouns, what your work is, and how it contributes to combating racism in the medical industry. Whenever you're ready, though, we can also, if you need time, move on to another question.
This works. Hi, I'm Anna. I am a 7th year MD PhD student at UW-Madison. My pronouns are she, her. I actually just came from a meeting with the Wisconsin Medical Society Task Force on Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, which is why I'm late. So I've been working in the policy sphere for quite some time now, trying to work on getting more equitable and more recently anti-racist policies adopted by the AMA, the Wisconsin Medical Society, and trying to move those big organized medicine, I guess industries or big organized medicine organizations towards devoting their resources to combating racism and combating injustices. Did that answer the question?
That definitely answered the question. Thank you so much. Yeah, we just were talking about kind of the history of racism in medical research, and I think we're going to kind of segue into how it's still present today. So I think that someone else will, Karissa has a question for everyone.
Yes, okay. So, all right. And would anybody be willing to talk about medical racism today, and specifically of the context of the COVID pandemic and how it's currently affecting communities of color and other marginalized identities right now?
This is just open to the panel, or?
Yes,
Sorry.
this is just open to anybody. So any of the panelists can unmute and chime in.
Well, I'll go ahead and start. So I think one thing that has been interesting to see in the response to the COVID-19 pandemic was there was such a movement to try to find a gene to place the disparities on, to say that there's a genetic reason why there are these disparities. And I don't know, it's been kind of astounding to see so much emphasis put on that when it's really just that we have a society that has structural racism built into where people live and where you go to school and the kind of healthcare that you can get, and also just a well-placed, often mistrust of medicine by communities that have been hurt by it. So I think that's been an interesting phenomenon to see, that people are so eager to say it's a gene when really it's just that we have so many injustices in the society.
Yeah, we also received kind of a follow-up question from our RSVP form just about how, I guess it says, how could the vaccine be verified as safe to communities who have a wary view of government healthcare?
Well, one thing that I think is important to note, at least from the data that I've seen, looking at how BIPOC communities are responding to vaccination, is that while there's more hesitancy amongst Black Americans about the vaccine, they're equally likely in the end to actually get it. And a thing that makes a lot of sense is given how much ongoing experience many Black Americans have with racism in the medical setting, it makes a lot of sense that they're hesitant. And there's also a tendency within conversations that are emerging about vaccine hesitancy around COVID to talk again about Tuskegee as kind of like the example of why Black Americans are hesitant to get vaccinated. And that misses the point that the histories of discrimination for many Black Americans are much, much more recent and much closer to home, thinking about how it is that they themselves or their loved ones have been ignored and dismissed within medical settings. So I think a really important point in thinking about vaccine hesitancy is to realize the reasons why people are hesitant are much more recent than these kind of long 50-year historical events. They have to do with whether or not they trust the providers that they've been seeing, in the last couple of years. And so I think it's less about, sort of giving information about vaccine safety and more about trying to build trust with communities of color between medical providers and those communities.
And I would even question, I was going to say, I would question the impression that many people have that communities of color are more resistant. I think it's white Republicans, right? White male Republicans have the highest rate of vaccine resistance, but then in that case, it's not treated as irrational, but anyway.
I think it's ironic that this is an issue that's sort of preventing the United States as a whole from realizing the goal of herd immunity. And I'm thinking about other instances in history where racism, basically undermined US objectives. Like Susan was talking about the segregation of blood and plasma. That was done during World War II as well. And think about what efficiencies could have been realized if you did not have a segregated army, if you could replace a white soldier with a Black soldier, and if you could transfuse anybody. Right? So this country pays a price for its basic civic religion of racism.
I feel like just another layer that I'd like to mention is that not only are BIPOC people, do they have medical distrust of the medical system because of the disregard that they're often met with when going to see medical providers, but it's also because racism continues to play out in a way that Black people are at a higher risk for many more medical complications in a way that other people are not, that specifically white people are not, because they do not experience the same level of structural racism, discrimination, and bias. And so just an example of something that I'm very passionate about is Black maternal and infant health. And here in Wisconsin, Black babies are 3 times more likely to die before they reach age 1. And Black moms are 5 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related complications or in childbirth. That shocking disparity has nothing to do with any inherent differences that exist in health outcomes that Black people should generally have. It has everything to do with the racism that our society continues to perpetuate in all areas, in all, it's embedded in our very fabric, and it prevents Black people from receiving necessary prenatal and postnatal care that it could be life-saving.
Katrina, that's a really good segue actually into my next question that I wanted to ask, which was about reproductive justice. So you had talked a little bit about the reproductive justice movement and its goals in making sure that every birthing individual is able to achieve a fair and good birth experience. But I was kind of wondering about, can you speak more to the work maybe that you have done or other panelists have done to making sure that people are able to access reproductive justice and what that looks like today and in the context of Henrietta Lacks?
Sure, I can kick it off with one thing. So, at the Wisconsin Alliance for Women's Health, we are actually working on creating a legislative bill package that will address the disparities in maternal and infant health, and with a particular focus on the Black community because we have the most severe disparities here in Wisconsin and throughout the nation. And so an example of a reproductive justice related policy that we're looking to include in this package of bills is expanding Medicaid coverage postpartum to 12 months. So under current law, somebody who gives birth while receiving Medicaid coverage will have that coverage cut off in 60 days. And so obviously and we know too, it's important to note that most people who receive Medicaid coverage are low income people of color. And so if they are having their health insurance cut off after 60 days, Black women have less access to things like mental health treatment if they're experiencing any postpartum depression. They have less access to follow-up care if they're experiencing any complications from their pregnancy. And they just have less of an ability in general to receive the health care that they need because they quite literally cannot afford it and there are not other insurance options for them. So they're just left with no coverage options. And so that's an example of reproductive justice in that it recognizes that it's not just about that it doesn't like start and stop with access. You can say our doors are open, you're welcome to come in anytime. But if you don't have the means to do that or the ability to do that, you're not going to be able to actually have that access. Like if you don't have transportation to a doctor's appointment, because often when we look at transportation as well, the poorest communities have the least bus routes and bus lines and are most cut off from transportation options. I could just go on and on. But when you start to look at all of these different factors, you realize that access is severely limited for our most marginalized communities, which here in Wisconsin is particularly our low-income Black communities.
Moving towards a bit away from like a medical policy perspective and more towards treatment or exploitation. This question is kind of directed towards Dr. Lederer or Katrina, but anyone else, please jump in as well. Are there examples you can give of like modern day experimentation or exploitation in the medical and scientific field that are going unnoticed by the general public? And also to bring it back to the previous conversation, because we kind of were talking about historical medical experimentation and human experimentation. Would you be able to talk a bit about how much of our understanding of science kind of comes from these unethical exploitive treatments at the expense of vulnerable people?
I think so much of medical knowledge has been gained from the exploitation of marginalized people, you know, whether they're prisoners, whether they're the poor, whether they're immigrants, whether they're people of color, that it would be almost, I mean, if you wanted to take a principled stand and say, well, we're not going to use knowledge that was unethically obtained, I really don't know how you could draw the line, because so much of it was obtained under these difficult and painful and exploitative circumstances. It's hard for me to speak to sort of what's going on now, since I no longer sit on an IRB and I haven't been paying as much attention to the current landscape of exploitation. Although I will say, you know, if we think that regulation is the answer, the current laws that we have to regulate human experimentation only apply to research that's funded under the auspices of the federal government. And so I do know of experiments that have been conducted, in the Caribbean, for example, in which people who are desperate are willing to take vaccines, that an entrepreneur has developed, that there's a lot of, a lot of experimentation going on that isn't reported in the popular press or in medical journals, but occurs outside and with little surveillance and oversight, if that's what's important to protecting the welfare of participants in human trials. But well, except with one exception, in this country, we need people to participate in phase 1 trials of new drugs, right? So who are the population that will participate in that? They're people, largely people of color, men between the ages of 20 and 40, who are paid to participate in trials of new drugs. We have an organization sort of close by in Madison that hires people to, allow a range of interventions on their bodies in exchange for, hopefully a good sum of money, but with little protection for these human subjects. And there's a lot of really excellent work going on now to sort of make clear who's bearing the cost, the physical cost, the biological cost, the existential cost of getting the knowledge that we all think is, that we all benefit from when it develops new drugs that improve our own bodies and health.
I'd love to really address the exploitation component of your question that we're still seeing today. But I'd like to tie it to historical exploitation that we've seen, and then describe a few ways how we still see it showing up today. So one thing that I'd like to mention is the eugenics movement, and how there was a belief, and there still is a belief, that it was undesirable to have Black babies. It was more desirable to have white children and to sort of create this more pure breed. And with that came the forced sterilization of many, many Black women who were literally forced to not have children because of this racist idea that their children would not be able to really, they wouldn't like, it was just embedded, like they just didn't have the right genetics, they weren't as superior as a white child would be. And so with that forced sterilization in mind, today we see a lot of coercion with birth control and the Black community. And so often if there is a young Black parent who ends up pregnant and has a child, right after giving birth, that young Black person is going to be told they have to get an IUD, which is a long-term birth control mechanism. And they will be so coerced into it that the physician will literally almost provide them no other option. They will feel that they have no other option because that physician may be basing some of their thoughts that this young Black kid has to get an IUD because they are not fit to continue raising children, to continue having children. And this shows up in a lot of ways. Even if somebody were to go to the doctor's office and say they want the birth control pill, if a physician does not trust that patient to actually know what's best for themselves and know what reproductive healthcare decision they would like to make, particularly in the cases of Black women, then more long-term aggressive birth control methods will be pushed onto them. And forced sterilization definitely still happens today too.
Building off of that. Oh, sorry, Olivia. Did you
No,
want to
you go
ask?
ahead.
Okay.
Oh, well, yeah, no, you can go ahead.
Sounds good. Something that I wanted to ask kind of as a follow-up question to that is in one of my classes, which is called Childbirth in America with Professor Annie Menzel, and we have talked about Indigenous people having their reproductivity or their reproductive health controlled. Specifically, Indigenous people were had to undergo forced sterilizations, and the government deemed what bodies could reproduce and which ones couldn't, which is kind of the idea that you were speaking to. So I was wondering if you or any of the other panelists could speak more to that about how Indigenous populations have experienced reproductive injustice and how that really does tie in with Henrietta Lacks's story of medical racism and this desire to create or allow certain bodies to reproduce compared to others.
I could briefly speak on that. Yeah, so what you're referring to is in the 1970s, approximately 25% of the Native American women population of childbearing age were forcibly sterilized without their knowledge, without their full understanding, and also under extreme amounts of pressure and duress. Again, getting really to that idea of there were just some people who did not, who the medical industry believed could not reproduce desirable babies. And so this law did subsidize sterilizations for patients who received their care through the Indian Health Service. But that is when they were targets of those coercive sterilizations. So it was like, I'm not sure if I'm making a lot of sense, but there was a Family Planning Services and Population Research Act of 1970. And so it was through the guise of that act that many Native American women were sterilized forcibly. Does that make sense? Okay.
Yeah, and I'll add in that in the same time period that Katrina is talking about in the 1970s, in California, we also see migrant women being targeted for coercive sterilization, particularly Mexican migrants, and this fear of kind of hypersexualized other bodies that are having too many children. And there was actually a class action lawsuit that happened that was a kind of coordinated effort between a whistleblower doctor working in LA and a Chicana lawyer who got together to put together this group of patients who had been sterilized by doctors asking them basically if they wanted a tubal ligation while they were in labor without translators available. So nominally obtaining consent, but not actually obtaining consent at all. And they put together a class action lawsuit in the 1970s about this sterilization program. There's a really nice documentary on that particular kind of episode that interviews some of the plaintiffs of that case, as well as some of the whistleblowers and other people involved. And it's nice because it recovers their voices and their experiences of what it was like to be offered tubal ligation under these circumstances. And I think it's really important to hear from the voices of those directly affected in these kinds of cases.
Wasn't there a case just this past year in one of the immigrant detention centers where some doctor was sterilizing women, and basically gaslighting them in the process?
There were certainly reports of that in the press, but I don't know if there's been a thorough investigation. It would be interesting to know just how far and under what auspices that was being done. Because I think in the case of the Mexican migrants in Los Angeles County, the lawsuit that you're referring to, I don't know that it was a federal government program or whether it was physicians independently acting on their own to intervene against this population. But they certainly felt entitled to do so.
My understanding is that it was a state level program because California had one of the more aggressive eugenic sterilization programs early 20th century, and that legacy continued on in different forms post World War II, and this was one of them.
Okay, you're referring to Madrigal versus Quilligan?
Yeah.
In which the plaintiffs did not prevail, right?
I'll put the link into the chat to the documentary, which I think is really worth viewing for sure.
Yeah, so we kind of brought up eugenics and the eugenics movement, and we're obviously talking about some of the effects of that huge movement in the US. And I know that Dr. Nelson, you specialize in the American eugenics movement, and so we were just wondering if you could kind of explain to our audience what this movement was, what its effects were in medicine, and just kind of how the effects are still, like, they still have roles in medicine today, or anybody, but yeah, start with Dr. Nelson.
Sure, yeah, Sue, you should feel free to chime in as well, because Sue is at least as knowledgeable as I am. But I think some of the really key things to recognize about the American eugenics movement are that, one, the US was at the forefront of the eugenics movement in the early 20th century. So a misperception about eugenics is that, the eugenic kind of legacy is tied to the Holocaust and the Nazi regime. And in fact, they were kind of, looking at the American states because both forced sterilization policies were happening at the state level, for inspiration, basically, or, as a policy to aspire to. And so we need to, as Americans, I think, really, be taking a close look at our own history there in relation to the history of eugenics. Another thing that's really important to realize is that a lot of prominent medical doctors and scientists were involved in eugenics because they saw it as a way to extend the science of the time for the supposed benefit of the public. So, for example, Charles Van Hise, as the president of the university here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, would lecture about the Wisconsin idea, about how it is that we needed to use the knowledge of the university for the benefit of the state. And one of the examples that he would use in that speech is the application of eugenics to solving the social ills of the day. The Eugenics Record Office, which is kind of the main engine of eugenics research and policy advocacy, is housed at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, which is a major research institution of the time, and was formed out of a subcommittee of the American Breeders Association, which was an association of scientists who were involved in plant and animal breeding. So there are really direct ties here between both the medical community and the scientific community in terms of promulgating this science as well as this policy in this time period.
I guess, so one, I can't add anything to the history perspective on that. This is fascinating to hear about as well. From being a medical trainee, I think there's been a shift in kind of how we view interacting with patients. And when I started medical school, I was taught you have you are working with the patient, you're not doing things to the patient, you're working with the patient, it's a relationship. But I think some older physicians I've spoken to have a much more kind of paternalistic way of approaching medicine, and especially of approaching women's health. I've certainly seen patients in the office who had no idea what their birth control was doing, and they've been on it, since they were teenagers. Someone just put them on the pill or something like that. So I think there is kind of the way that we teach about women's health in medicine for a long time was very focused on you tell the women what they're going to do, or not really trusting women to make decisions about their bodies, or even to know what birth control was doing to them.
On a related note of eugenics and stuff like that, I apologize, this question wasn't in the list that we presented all of you, so if it's a bit out of left field, I apologize. I was wondering if any of you were interested in discussing kind of like CRISPR-Cas9 implications for editing human genomes. And I know that's a whole can of worms to open, but if any of you want to speak to that, or we can ignore it completely. But yeah, like thoughts and feelings. Yeah.
I can take a first stab at that question, and I'll take a stab at it by referencing some of the work done by a sociologist named Troy Duster, who started writing during the early days of the Human Genome Project to point out that the way in which we might get a backdoor to eugenics, as what he called it, was probably not through a repeat of kind of state or federal level policies coercively sterilizing individuals like we saw in the early 20th century. What he saw was more of a scenario in which individual prejudices and biases acted on by couples in a reproductive setting might add up to the same sort of widespread discrimination that we saw in the early 20th century in the case of the eugenics movement. And by what he meant is in a setting where a couple is making a reproductive choice, or where a healthcare provider is offering a couple a reproductive option, as Katrina has already outlined, that's a place in which societal biases are going to come into play about which options they're offered, or, for example, whether or not they're going to continue on with a pregnancy. And these problems that Duster is pointing to, that those biases are going to inform treatment at the individual level, are exactly the kinds of decisions that I think that we are likely to face in the case of CRISPR-Cas9, because the American bioethical system tends to sort of solve a lot of problems by saying that we should leave it to individual choice. But individuals carry with them all of their biases and prejudices. And so many individual choices added up on a social scale are just going to repeat those prejudices. So that's, one way I think of thinking about how it is that we might get to eugenics by the back door in, the very eloquent words of Troy Duster.
We can move on to another question. So bringing in everything that we've talked about at this panel right now, we've talked a lot about problems, but what are some solutions we can talk about, in terms of healthcare systems? How can we make healthcare systems more equitable for people of color and other people who may be disenfranchised by them?
I kind of want to be like, how big are we allowed to dream here? Health insurance is not tied to employment status. Health insurance for all people, more doctors of color, those are some things that would really help.
Right.
Go big. How do we fix it? I mean, it's a big problem. We need big solutions, right?
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Olivia.
No, you should go ahead.
Okay.
I was going to narrow it down, but I feel like you have something profound to say, so I'm not going to do that yet, okay?
I wish it was profound. I was going to say there is no shortage of policies that we need to see enacted in order to make real tangible change in the way that people of color and other marginalized people are treated by the healthcare system. But what I think is really at the root, we can enact policies until we're blue in the face, but unless we have true societal change and a societal shift in the way in which we view people who are worthy of receiving healthcare access, who are worthy of receiving quality healthcare, then we're not going to see a lot of movement, because we are still seeing the same problems that we saw 200 years ago in this country with I talk a lot about Black women because that's my thing. So, but obviously there are many, many more marginalized people that we've already talked about, like Latinx women, Native women, trans, non-binary people. But in the context of Black women, we have seen them continue to be abused and mistreated by the medical system, going back to the time of slavery to present day. And the one thing that's remained constant throughout that time is it's not really the policies. The policies have shifted, the policies have changed, but cultural attitudes have not changed all that much. If Black women in the 1800s were believed to not experience pain, and present day, Black women, when they tell their pain to a physician, are seen as dramatic or whining or exaggerating, then we still have a lot of work left to do on changing opinions and attitudes and deracializing our own beliefs and the beliefs of our friends and our loved ones and our neighbors and our communities before we can really see the effects of positive policy change.
I'll follow on to what Katrina was saying. I think first, the number of Black men in medical school right now, I'm sure you've all seen this stat, is the same as it was in the 1970s. Like we have the policies in place in some cases, but I think, you know, there's so much built against that we really need a seismic change. I think there has been incredible work done by oftentimes medical students and usually medical students of color right now, who are leading the way in trying to put anti-racist medical curriculums as something that you start medical school with. So in the past year, this has really taken off with people trying to get ahead of the racism that you develop in medical school, because really, when you go to medical school, you're taught racism, you get more racist. That's something that a friend of mine says often because there's so much racism baked into how we do medicine. If you look at some of the textbooks and like you're taught stereotypes, there was one in 2017 that like listed out stereotypes that nursing students are supposed to learn, which is just ridiculous, but it was actually in a textbook page. So I think that's one thing that I think we need to start doing, is to get ahead of that in medical school. And yes, to get a lot more students from marginalized communities into medicine, and to prioritize the things that they're asking for. So to get them into medicine, and then also to retain those students, and to prioritize the things that they're asking for, and not just get them into medicine and then expect them to, you know, follow the steps of why we have such a struggle in healthcare as it is.
Thank you, Hannah, for providing that insight, especially as an MD candidate, and kind of like along the lines of medical schools and other institutions, if at all, how are medical schools and other institutions for continuing education engaging with a long history of racism in medicine? And also just for context, this question was from our RSVP form, so it's a little bit long. So I'll just read out the full question and then we can kind of break it down into different parts. What are current initiatives to correct or change these issues, especially considering the way data-driven methodologies are based around compiling information? Like, how do we get around this issue when data is collected around racist assumptions? Or like, are there particular areas of medicine that are more addressed and commented on than others? So I guess, again, this is just from our RSVP form. So we can just start off with like, the first part of like how, you know, just overall, like how are medical schools or institutions for like postgraduate education, how are those engaging with the history of racism in medicine?
I can say I wish they taught us the history of racism in medicine in medical school, because they don't. That's something that you don't learn it unless you're looking for it, unless you go out and teach yourself. And that is something that started to change. Like this past summer, there was a huge movement. I think there were over 100 schools that started adding again, this was led by medical students putting in a curriculum about the history of racism in medicine that they started their curriculum with. They started their first years learning that curriculum. And I think that's huge, because then you start medical school understanding what you're walking into, and you don't walk into it blindly and just accept that, you know, the things you're being told, you know, that there's so many horrible stereotypes that they teach you once you start learning. And if you don't walk in with your eyes open, you learn those, and then you perpetuate that system of racism. And I think there has been partly driven, well, in large part driven by patients. There's been a movement to try to stop using race as biology. So right now, there are lots of medical calculators. There's a great paper, Hidden in Plain Sight, that was in the New England Journal that described a lot of different calculators that use race, which is a social construct, use it as a factor in these calculators that decide how we're going to treat you medically. So there was this calculator that used, for kidney function, it would inflate your kidney numbers if you were Black. And this assumption, like you look at the EGFR and you use a multiplier for folks who are Black, which, you know, there was never a scientific reason to do that. The folks who originally put that race-based multiplier into the calculator had their data was terrible. They had like a 1,500 person study and less than 200 of them were Black, and they found this number. They're like, oh yes, this is, you know, their kidney numbers are different because they're Black. There was no good reason for it. They relied on the racist assumption from way back when that Black people had more muscle mass, and we still use that calculator today. So there's really been a push from patients, from medical students, to try to get that kind of racism out of medicine, because it perpetuates the idea that someone's body can be different or inferior just on their race, that there's a biological difference there. So that is one change that I see students trying to get anti-racist curriculum into medicine, and also trying to get those kind of racist assumptions and automatic calculators that we use out of medicine.
I will say I've been teaching in medical schools, you know, for over 30 years. And just in the last 3 years is the first time I've seen really explicit attention to racism in medicine as part of the first year curriculum for medical students. Now, whether that's enough, I can't say, but it's for the first time. And I think, you know, a large part of the credit goes to medical students, but I think, you know, at least at our medical school, we do, you know, we're fortunate to have the support of the administration, who at least are saying in ways that I've never heard deans say before, they're committed to anti-racist, you know, medical education. So that is a change. Now, how, you know, how far this will go remains to be seen, but I take this as a, you know, a long-awaited sign, you know, of recognition that something needs to be done.
Maybe since you've got 3 historians here on the panel, I'll put in a plug as well for how the doing of history can be really important to raising awareness about these issues as well. So a lot of the stories that we've been talking about with respect to the origins of American gynecology and the way in which enslaved Black women's bodies were really the sort of substrate on which, you know, this experimentation happened, was built. A lot of that knowledge comes to us from a scholar named Deirdre Cooper Owens, who's written this lovely book now, what, about like 4 years ago, something like that, where she details this history of exploitation, as well as Black women's experiences under slavery and medicine, and the way in which they acted as medical providers, even within plantations. And this book, I think, has had a really significant impact on a lot of people who have read it. It's a lot of work to do this kind of history, to be able to recover the experiences of enslaved women, because it's difficult to try and find the source work to be able to sort of put together what this experience looked like. And so it's a real work of care. But Sue actually commented, you know, recently when we were looking at applications, that we are seeing now a group of, you know, young historians who've been inspired by this book specifically, and knowing this history and wanting to be able to know and tell more of these kinds of stories. So, this is not directly related to medical education, but, one thing that we need in order to confront the history of racism in medicine is good histories of racism in medicine. And I think those can be really powerful when people take the time and care and effort to put them together in the way that Cooper Owens did with this book, Medical Bondage.
All right, building on the conversation that we're having right now and thinking about ways that we can combat medical racism in creating a more equitable healthcare field, something that I was thinking about is COVID-19 and how people of color are not often believed when they express symptoms of having COVID, and how a lot of times hospitals or medical institutions are not geared to really serve people of color. For example, there was an article that was released talking about how when measuring oxygen levels, like when using a pulse ox, it can actually give the wrong amount of oxygen levels or oxygen saturation levels in the body because it is not geared for people with darker skin tones. So, thinking about those sorts of things, I was just kind of wondering how do we address that? Because a lot of times, even in medical education, there is a lot of diseases are taught assuming that people are white, but there are different skin tones, different skin shades, and rashes, or like this oxygen saturation measurement might not be visible if you're only taught one sort of narrative.
I mean, I feel like in a lot of ways you answered the question that you just posed by pointing us to a lot of examples of where, these kinds of stereotyping racist assumptions are built in, and where the technology is, tested and calibrated on white skin, and, people of color, skin of color is not really taken into account. And there is a difficult question here in terms of, building up a foundation of knowledge about how to recognize and address these types of issues in patients of color, because as we have been talking about for the last hour, so much of medical knowledge has come from the exploitation of people of color, as well as other vulnerable and marginalized groups. So asking them to participate in research is something that can be tricky because of that history of abuse and a very, reasonable distrust that a lot of people have around medical experimentation and medical participation. So this is where, I would come back to having more practitioners of color as really one important step forward, and more researchers of color who are able to kind of lead the way in doing research about, for example, dermatology cases looking at skin of color and how the presentation of different diseases is different in Black skin when you only see textbook cases of white skin. And I think that a lot of that leadership comes from having researchers of color and doctors of color in that space doing that work.
If I could just add on, I completely agree with everything that was just mentioned. I also think that when we bring in more doctors of color and more researchers of color, that we need to have the systems and structures in place to support them in those positions. Because I feel like, especially here in the United States, we get trapped in this cycle where we say we need more people of color, we need more Black people at the university, we need this, we need that. But then when we get that, the environment cannot support adequately the amount of racism, discrimination, and prejudice that people of color face on a daily basis from their own colleagues, from the policies embedded into the institution. And so I absolutely agree. We need more researchers and doctors of color. We need better support for researchers and doctors of color. And also, the only other thing that I'd like to say is that we also need to, when we do that work, we need to be careful to not come back to this idea that it's the responsibility of people of color to fix this mess that others have put us in. It is not our responsibility to undo the harms that the medical system has perpetuated for generations against us and our ancestors. That is the responsibility of the people who did that in the first place. That is the responsibility of the people who have the power to make those changes. And often that's white people.
Well, thank you for your insight on that. I think that really helps kind of put into perspective how we can move forward given all of these problems that are here. Adding on to this idea of moving forward, do you feel that there have been sufficient reparations or steps taken by scientific and medical communities to address Henrietta's stories? If not, could you speak a little bit to what further steps could be taken?
I feel like that's a Sue question.
All right. Well, one thing that, I think Henrietta's case has produced some distinctive things. Rebecca Skloot set up a foundation, right, that was intended to provide educational opportunities and other kinds of opportunities for the Lax family. I think one of the things that's really extraordinary is the access that members of the Lax family had to the highest levels of American medical research. Dinner meetings with Francis Collins, the head of NIH, who was educating them about the science to which Henrietta's cells have been so vital. I don't know that that's a form of reparation. And I guess I'm thinking about reparations that have occurred or efforts to compensate people injured, say, by eugenics, like the program in North Carolina, to try to compensate people whose lives were materially altered by their forcible sterilization. But that's one of the few states that's been willing to provide monetary compensation. Other states have issued apologies or they've expressed their profound sorrow, but they haven't followed up with any, real tangible reparations. When President Clinton apologized for the Tuskegee syphilis study, he did provide funds for Tuskegee University to set up a bioethics group that would, at least part of its purchase would be to explore how to protect communities of color and facilitate their empowerment when it comes to medical research. So, I would say in terms of experimental abuse that I can think of, and again, I'd like to hear more about what the word reparations means here, but certainly there has been litigation and there have been settlements to try to compensate people for the injuries they received by participating, say, in human radiation studies that disproportionately included African Americans, for example, in plutonium or whole body radiation studies. So that's, I think I'm thinking of those programs.
If I might take the question a little bit in a different direction. So thinking about reparations in terms of training Black doctors, right? So in 1910, there was something called, this is going to be a different direction, sorry, the Flexner Report, which closed down all but 2 of the Black medical schools at the time. And that was commissioned by the AMA in part and some other groups. But that resulted in a huge deficit of Black physicians. I think it was estimated that had they not closed down those 5 schools, there would be somewhere around 30,000 additional Black physicians in the workforce today. That's, I don't know, I can't imagine the impacts of that. So you think about reparations with something like that, and we haven't seen that in the medical field. There was an apology by the AMA to Black physicians in 2008, but there was no money behind that. There was no force behind that. So I think the idea of reparations in medicine and research is, I think we get the part where you say sorry. We've done that in a number of cases, but I don't think, I think reparations are still something that we're working towards, and we need to do a lot more. And I think that gets back to kind of what Nicole was saying, like, how big can we think? Like, how big are we willing to go? Because we do need to go really big if we're going to say that we've, you know, adequately done something like reparations.
I'm sorry, I can't, I mean, it's technically not true that the Flexner report closed those Black medical colleges. They were closed because they were undercapitalized and they didn't have funds to support them. And it's true, you know, so it's technically not true to say that it closed them down. There were other forces that was moving against that. And as other people have pointed out, you know, so it wasn't enough just to get into medical school. Then they set up residency requirements, but then there weren't hospitals that would allow people of color to go, you know, be an intern for a year in order to get your medical license. So it's another opportunity in which people have seen the goalposts, you know, once you get into this part, well, then they move the goalposts further. And it maybe goes to Katrina's point too about, well, it's not enough to get people into an educational institution. You have to support them. You have to facilitate their success and retention down the road.
If I could offer my thoughts on this question as well. Thank you for allowing me to speak so much. I feel like I have been very vocal, but one thing that I'd like to say in regards to reparations and specifically the HeLa cells is when I think of the word reparations or the action of reparations, I think of righting a wrong. But specifically in regards to the HeLa cells, I don't believe that there has been enough of recognizing that there was even a wrong. And so I really draw that because the family, first of all, there wasn't much acknowledgement that this was not a moral practice or a beneficial practice to medical research until the family finally found out 5 decades later that that Henrietta's cells were used in this way. And then when they began to express concern about how they never received any compensation for all of these medical advancements and whatnot. And even still today, I find that people are more willing to make excuses for why her cells were taken and say, well, there wasn't a policy or, it wasn't painful, just a variety of excuses, as opposed to actually acknowledging and recognizing that it was wrong. It wasn't okay then, it's not okay now, and there needs to be actionable, tangible steps taken to fix it. But without that recognition, I don't think you can have reparations. I don't think you can write it.
If we're talking about reparations and we're talking about, there's not enough recognition for it, or there's not what are they going to look like, I guess. Do any of you have any thoughts on where they would come from, even if we've talked about, HeLa cells are in every bio lab, every university, every hospital in the world. More, that might be an exaggeration, but incredibly important. And so, where do they come from if they're so widespread? And the initial receivers of the cell lines, from Dr. Guy, they didn't know the story. So they didn't have their own, kind of knowledge of they were taking someone's cells. If they would have resisted, that's another discussion. But either way, they spread so far without any acknowledgement. Where do they come from? Is this on Johns Hopkins? I believe they've built a Henrietta Lacks building, I think. Or does this come from medical institutions that are close by? Or yeah, are there any thoughts on if you were to design the reparation plan, what do you think it would look like?
when you were mentioning the complicated nature of assigning reparations, particularly in regards to the HeLa cells, it really reminded me of like the conversation around providing reparations for slavery and how people are like, oh, how are you going to track down who was related to who, where they were at? Like there's such bad historical records. Or like in the case of my family was slaves in Jamaica. They weren't slaves in here. So, you know, how do you then parse that out? And like, where do you draw the line? And I honestly, I have no patience for all of those ridiculous details. Like, I think the only thing that matters is that her cells were unjustly taken. It advanced medical research in more ways than we can even fully understand. And her family and she received nothing because of that. Like, I think it's that simple. Her cells are still being used to this day to advance medical research as recently as the COVID-19 vaccine. And her family continues to see no benefit from all of the medical progress that her cells have made. And I know you didn't ask, but that's how I feel similarly about slavery reparations as well. Slavery continues to impact everyday life for Black Americans. And it doesn't matter if their family were slaves in Georgia, North Carolina, or the Bahamas. Slavery has created a beast in the United States that continues to permeate everyday life structures, society, beliefs, etc.
I know Sue's mentioned a couple of times that, you know, the Lax family, that, you know, Francis Collins and sort of leadership of the NIH has been in conversation for a number of years with the Lax family. And I think one important thing that has come out of that you saw in Rebecca Skloot's overview is this idea of returning control over genetic research on those cells to her family. Because one of the issues that, you know, no one was thinking about at the time at all, at least to my knowledge, is that, of course, these immortal cell lines can carry the genetic information of Henrietta Lacks, but also carry information to some extent about her living kin. And having, you know, this information available in labs across the world means that, you know, lots of people now, especially with access to sequencing technologies, are able to, you know, sort of glean something about her, you know, without her consent. And so returning the sort of right of refusal and power of review to the Lax family to decide what research they think is beneficial to do and under what conditions they are willing to give permission to researchers to do genetic research on her cells, I think is a really powerful move in terms of restoring the family's kind of control over the type of research that's done with that information.
And I would mention, you know, there have been some successful efforts. I'm thinking here of the Havasupai tribe, who worked with an NIH unit to explore issues in diabetes, and then found out their genetic material was being shared to do studies of, say, you know, behavioral or mental illness. And they were able to sue, and they sued, I think, Arizona State University, and Arizona State University returned their genetic, you know, the information about their genetic samples to them. So, I mean, that may not seem like much, but it does, I think, set a powerful precedent over people having control, at least some control, over their own biological and informational destinies. I guess I'm wondering if your audience sent in any questions, or, I mean, are there things that they wanted more information or conversation about.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Lederer, for transitioning into the next phase. So we have about 10 minutes left here. We do want to open up the floor to the audience. So if the audience would like to ask any questions, now is the chance. Questions about what our panelists have shared with us, questions about connections you may have to personal experiences or classes or just anything in general. Yeah, so feel free if everyone here wants to take a minute or two to maybe think and kind of ponder what we have been talking about, because it is a lot. It can be mentally and emotionally taxing, so I want to acknowledge that.
Hello, hi. I have been listening to this panel for the whole time, and I would like to say thank you for everybody who put this together. I think I might have put some questions together. I can't remember. But I think props to Jake and Amy and Olivia and Karissa for putting this together. I couldn't remember your name, Karissa. I've never met you before. Sorry. But I think it's really appropriate given the circumstances that we have during the pandemic and how, medicine and, society and all of these entities that we don't think of as interconnected are actually really more intertwined with each other than we'd like to think. So I just wanted to say thank you, and that all the information that I thought I was like super crazy to just delve into in high school was something that other people are pretty passionate about too.
Of course, thank you so much for attending. Do you or does anyone else in the audience have any questions before we conclude this program?
I guess that brings to mind something you talk about reading a lot of stuff and delving deep into the literature. I think that's something that's super important for anyone who's thinking about going into a medical field or a research field, is to educate yourself as much as you can, and honestly to go to things like this where you're learning from incredible historians and people with lived experience who are working on these kinds of things. So I think that's laudable that you're all here, and laudable to the hosts that you're trying to put this stuff together and like help educate yourselves and help educate other people. Because I think, we talk about racism in medicine and racism in research, and it's so interwoven, and it's something that you might not see unless you're looking for it, unless you know how to look for it. And I think that's just incredibly important that you keep learning about it. So thank you for being interested in this and trying to learn more about it.
Great. Well, it doesn't look like we have any more questions, just a lot of sincere thank yous from everyone. And yeah, I just want to thank all the panelists again for coming and teaching us about your experiences and sharing your knowledge. This has been a really educational event for a lot of people. And I hope that everyone continues to reflect on what they've learned today and finds ways to combat this issue however they can.
Yeah, I just want to echo what you said, Olivia. I really want to thank all the panelists because I learned a lot. I always think that like I know about a topic, and then I hear about perspectives and ideas that only enhance and deepen my understanding about an issue. So I learned a lot more about Henrietta Lacks, and really thinking about medical racism as someone who wants to enter the healthcare field. I think there is an obligation to learn about these systems of oppression and make medicine an equitable field. So I really want to thank all of the panelists again for helping me, and a lot of our audience members here get to that next step. But yeah.
If I could just say something, surprise, surprise. I just wanted to say that, yes, I echo, thank you so much, everybody who wants to be here, is here learning about this, particularly if you want to go into the medical field, but also especially if you don't. Like, I have no interest in ever doing anything medicine related. I just not smart enough. But it is so important to still know about all of these things so that you can see how they show up in other aspects of our society, in other parts of our lives, in other systems. So thank you.
All right, so I will conclude with the last thank you. Again, thank you everyone for attending. Panelists, thank you so much for being willing to talk for 2 hours. Good Lord, y'all are great, especially the work that you do. And thank you participants and co-hosts for making this event possible. To all the participants, I will be sending you either a link to the recording of this video and the entire transcript of this recording as well. So be on the lookout for that. And have a good night, everybody. Stay safe.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you.